in current affairs, it does seem to me like I think you refer to it as a totalitarian tiptoe, where there's an overall goal of like a global society, but at the moment it's at a stage where it's looking to me like we could end up in World War III, either in North Korea or Iran, or it just seems to be like America's constantly rattling the cage to put everyone's back up. North Korea seems like a prime example at the moment. And what's your take on that?
Well, you see, the whole Trump phenomena was ridiculous because great chunks of the so-called alternative media in America got behind Trump, saying that this guy was going to be different, this guy was going to change things. I was pointing out throughout the election campaign that this guy was just another puppet of the same as the others, because what they have to keep doing to keep people interested is they have to keep changing the persona. So after I'm about change, I'm change, change, change in every sentence, Obama, you then had this drain the swamp, anti-establishment Trump. They all have different persona labels, but they're all controlled by the same force, because no matter who comes in, whatever party it is, or whatever they said in the election campaign, the same thing, the same program, the same direction of the world keeps going. So this project for the New American Century list of countries have been picked off under the Republican and Labour governments of Bush and Blair, under the Democrat and Conservative governments of Obama and Cameron, and now under the Republican and Conservative governments of Trump and May, because they're here today, gone tomorrow. But the permanent government, what some people call the deep state these days, is always there, and its agenda is what unfolds. So I posted something on the internet very quickly after Trump was elected to say a key word of the Trump administration, Iran. Because, well, how did I know that? Because it was on the list of the project for the New American Century, and they hadn't ticked it off yet, so it was coming. And that now, of course, we've got this demonization of Iran and pulling out of the nuclear deal, and for no other reason than this ludicrous Netanyahu PowerPoint presentation. And so it's another weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. They needed an excuse to tick Iraq off the list, so they made one up. They then had a process of demonization of Gaddafi because they needed to get rid of him, a demonization of Assad because they want to get rid of him. The Russians have thrown a spanner in that works currently. And so they now need an excuse for Iran. So it's the nuclear deal, and they are sponsoring terrorism, when the biggest sponsor of terrorism in the Middle East, apart from Israel, is Saudi Arabia, who are bosom buddies, of course, with both Israel and the United States and Britain. And people should watch for Lebanon, because they want Lebanon as well. So that will be demonized and brought into this, no doubt, through a connection to Iran. And it's a plan, and
it's like an ongoing play that is, once you're sort of outside of the postage stamp, you can see it happening.
Just very quickly on North Korea. As I said, when this coming together with South Korea started a few weeks ago, this is all very nice and exactly what should be happening. Two countries next to each other talking rather than going through America, but America doesn't want that. The last thing America wants is a coming together and a peace between the two Koreas. And therefore, what they want to do is scupper what is happening, so they can re-demonize the leader of North Korea, because they want one of two things. They want control of the whole of what they call Eurasia, because as they've said in their own writings and books by their own people, you control Eurasia, this great landmass from Europe to China and from Russia to the Middle East, and you control the world. They want control of that in one of two ways. One, a war, a series of wars, and eventually a war with the West against Russia, China, and its allies, including Iran, no doubt, or the capitulation of those countries to U.S. domination. Either way, they've got control of Eurasia. So either they intimidate people into acquiescence, or they go to war with them. One of those two. And the reason that America is what it is, and has been created like this from the start, is because it is the prime global weapon. There are others, but it's the prime global weapon of this web. This is why America spends more on the military, and this is only the public figure, the real figure is absolutely fantastically greater, more on the military than something like the next 10 countries combined, including China and Russia combined. And it's because it is the army of the web, and it is creating mayhem and invading countries and creating catastrophe in countries on behalf of the web. And this hidden hand that controls the presidents answers to the web. They're agents of the web. The Project for the New American Century are agents of the web. Therefore, it doesn't matter who the president is, the web is dictating through the president, which is why Trump now has become the absolute epitome of all the others before him in terms of foreign wars. When in his election campaign, which the alternative media bought in their naivety, he was saying that America had to stop getting involved in other people's countries and regime change, which is exactly the opposite of what he's done in power, of course.
He's changed the tune. That sort of moves on a bit into regard to ISIS, just to give a bit more background about the sort of hostility I've received since I've started questioning the official narrative, and also sort of sharing your YouTube links. One former colleague said to me, going to see you was the worst thing that I've ever done, and that you're an apologist for these Islamic terrorists. But that moves us on maybe to ISIS. I mean, ISIS aren't what people might think they are. That they were sort of. I think you say in your show that the headquarters for ISIS is the Pentagon.
Yeah, Jimmy Carter's former national security advisor, he died last year at some quite high age, was Zbigniew Brzezinski. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, see, the way it works, as I said in Southport, is you've got the Republican Party, and that's controlled by a group called the neocons. With the neocons or neoconservatives, they're the ones that created the Project for the American Century. And then you've got the Democratic Party. They're controlled in the shadows by a similar group. I call that the democons. And then one step further back into the shadows, the democons and the neocons answer to the same masters, and therefore those masters in the shadows, working through the democons and the neocons, control whichever president is in power, Democratic or Republican, and thus their agenda is what unfolds through those people. And Zbigniew Brzezinski was a democon, and he wrote some books. One was called The Grand Chessboard, in which he was talking about, they don't give you the context, this is why, and this is what I'm working for. They present it as, this is my opinion. He said America's got to control Eurasia, which is where all these countries being targeted and demonized are.
Yeah.
But he did an interview with a Paris news magazine some years ago, in which he admitted that the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, at the time that the Afghanistan government in Kabul was a satellite government of the Soviet Union, that America, had armed, funded and trained the Mujahideen to attack and undermine the Soviet-controlled government in Afghanistan. Because, he said, this was the quote, he wanted to give the Soviet Union their Vietnam, because he wanted to entice them into invading Afghanistan so that they would stop the Kabul government falling, which they did. And about 1 million Afghans died as a result. Not these people could care less. And it did have a major part in bringing an end to the Soviet Union when this Gorbachev guy brought it to an end. Another frontman for the West he was, Gorbachev. Anyway, the Mujahideen then morphed into Al-Qaeda. And as Robin Cook, former foreign secretary, said shortly before he died, by the way,
yeah,
that Al-Qaeda means the base or the database because Al-Qaeda was named after the database of Mujahideen fighters kept by the CIA. And, of course, the Al-Qaeda then that was given responsibility through bin Laden for 9/11 was the creation of the United States by the admission of the former national security advisor to Carter, who talked about how the Mujahideen were created by the Americans. And then the Al-Qaeda stage then moved into the ISIS stage, which is basically the same group under another name. and bringing more people in. And what that ISIS became was a proxy army of America and of Britain, by the way. Britain's always in there. And the idea was that ISIS would remove Assad. Now, if you remember, the Americans, because again, if you can create an enemy, then you can justify things that you would never be justified otherwise. When you created the enemy of the Soviet Union during the Cold War, you could have this vast build-up of nuclear weapons and the military justified by protecting us from the Soviet Union. You could have the creation of NATO and all that stuff because you have an enemy. The enemies are very good things if you want to make things happen that wouldn't normally happen. So the Americans wanted to get even more into the Middle East, and with an enemy called ISIS, they justified it, and there's this great movement of people and military to fight ISIS. And even though they're the biggest military in the world by a country mile, ISIS continued to, if you remember, move across Syria, getting closer and closer to Damascus. And in the end, Assad was on his last legs, and the Syrian military was on its last legs. And then Putin came in with Russia and air support. And suddenly, only when Russia came in, because they were actually trying to push ISIS back, did ISIS get pushed back, and what has happened now, this spanner in the works was thrown. And so you create the enemy, or you create the proxy army, because it's simple. If you keep invading countries openly, like invading Iraq, then people are going to question, why are we invading someone else? So what you do is you create proxy armies, which ultimately are controlled by you, although the vast majority in them don't know that. They think they're genuinely fighting some holy war, and they fight the war for you. Or what you do is you create a revolution where most of the people think they're genuinely fighting a revolution, but the people behind it are actually answering to the Western authorities, particularly America. In other words, the web.
Just to stop you on that one, that was also a delegate at the NUJ delegate conference that I keep going back to. He mentioned that criticism of George Soros is classic anti-Semitism, but I didn't know what he meant by that. What is that an argument that's got any validity to it, or?
This goes back to what I said to you earlier, that they've created this mantra of anti-Semitic trope, so that when you mention anyone who is Jewish for any form of manipulation, immediately that's an anti-Semitic trope. Well, Soros is the great manipulator of the left, what is called the progressive left, which is not the left that I knew as a kid. The left that's taken over the universities and the colleges in America and Britain and elsewhere, that the so-called progressive left, the progressive students. Do you know, he passed over $18 billion to the Open Society Foundation Network a few months ago. I mean, that's the level of spending that is behind this organization. That's why it can do what it does on the scale that it does. Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, started a campaign against him. I was in Hungary last year. There's posters everywhere, all over the place. In the streets, big boards and big posters, like advertising posters. And he's just announced in the last couple of days that he's pulling his organisation out of Hungary. Of course, Orban's just been massively voted back a couple of weeks ago. And I think Soros has thought, well, I'm not going to win this one. So he's out, or says he is.